In the early 2000s, diesel technology was at the center of a bold story in Europe. Diesel engines were widely associated with strong fuel efficiency and long distance practicality. Automakers, regulators, and many consumers believed diesel could be a bridge toward lower fuel use while still offering the driving range and performance people expected. For Volkswagen, diesel was more than a product choice, it became a strategic identity. The company promoted clean diesel as proof that modern engineering could deliver efficiency while meeting environmental rules. The challenge was that meeting the rules meant different things in different places. In Europe, diesel cars were popular and policy choices often favored diesel through taxation and market incentives. In the United States, where diesel passenger cars were less common, emission standards and enforcement culture were different, and regulators focused strongly on controlling nitrogen oxides, NOx, pollutants linked to air quality concerns. The US market was attractive but demanding. If Volkswagen could make diesel successful there, it would demonstrate technical leadership and strengthen a global brand message. At the same time, the engineering problem was hard. Reducing NOx in diesel engines can require advanced aftertreatment systems, careful calibration, and cost sensitive hardware choices. Making those systems work smoothly across a wide range of real world driving conditions hot, cold, short trips, highway loads, stop and go traffic adds complexity. The costs do not stop at the factory. Reliability, maintenance requirements, and customer expectations all shape what an automaker is willing to put into each vehicle. Volkswagen was competing not only against other companies, but against the market's expectations. Advertising and product positioning promised diesel that felt both enjoyable and environmentally responsible. Internally, teams faced deadlines, budgets, and performance targets. In large organizations, pressure can become quiet but constant. Ship on time, keep costs down, protect market share, hit growth goals, and do not disappoint. When a company expands globally, that pressure can multiply because what seems good enough in one region may be inadequate in another. This is where the core tension of Dieselgate began. The gap between what the technology could easily deliver at a given price point and what the regulatory and marketing claims required. In a healthy system, that gap is closed through investment and honest trade offs. Either the company pays more for better control systems, reduces performance, redesigns the product, or adjusts its promises. But if the organization becomes committed to a specific narrative, we can do it all at once, the risk rises that reality will be shaped to match the narrative rather than the other way around. Volkswagen's diesel push in the US relied on a family of engines and control strategies intended to satisfy emissions requirements while maintaining drivability and cost competitiveness. The clean diesel message was not a small campaign, it was a public symbol of competence. When a message becomes symbolic, it can become difficult for internal teams to raise uncomfortable truths. People may worry that acknowledging difficulties will be seen as failure, even when the difficulty is genuine and technical. An important part of this story is how modern cars are managed by software. Engine control units coordinate fuel injection, air handling, and emissions after treatment. Software is essential for efficiency and safety, but software also creates a new risk. It can be tuned to perform well under specific evaluation conditions while not delivering the same behavior elsewhere. That doesn't have to be intentional or deceptive. Many calibrations are legitimately optimized for standard conditions, but it becomes ethically and legally serious when the optimization is designed to misrepresent compliance. By 2014, Volkswagen's clean diesel vehicles were widely visible, particularly in the United States, supported by confident marketing and a growing customer base. On the surface, the narrative looked successful. Strong fuel economy, a European engineering identity, and a solution that seemed to combine performance and responsibility. Beneath the surface, the gap between official testing results and real world emissions performance was becoming the central risk, one that would soon attract the attention of researchers, regulators, and the public. Many corporate turning points begin outside the company, when outsiders ask questions that insiders have learned to avoid. In the Dieselgate story, a crucial role was played by independent researchers and organizations interested in understanding how vehicles performed beyond laboratory conditions. A key idea was simple. If emissions rules are designed to protect air quality, then measurements should reflect real driving as well as controlled tests. A research effort connected to West Virginia University, supported by a clean transport organization, used portable measurement equipment to evaluate emissions from diesel cars in everyday conditions. The results were surprising. The vehicles appeared to meet standards in official test settings, but emitted far higher levels of NOx during normal driving than expected. This was not a small difference that could be dismissed as measurement noise. It suggested a systematic gap between certification performance and real-world behavior. The researchers did not begin with the assumption of wrongdoing. In science and engineering, the first step is typically to validate the method, repeat measurements, and consider alternative explanations. Could road conditions differ? Could the equipment be off? Could maintenance, temperature, or driving patterns explain it? Yet, as questions were explored, the pattern persisted. The results raised a possibility that was uncomfortable for everyone involved. Either the technology was not working as claimed outside the lab, or the lab performance was not representative of real operation. Regulators in the United States, particularly the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and the California Air Resources Board, CARB, became involved as evidence accumulated. Their role was not simply to repeat tests, but to ask Volkswagen to provide explanations, conduct additional evaluations, and demonstrate how the vehicles complied under a broad set of conditions. This phase is important because it shows how compliance is not just about passing a single test. It is also about responding credibly to questions when unexpected results appear. Volkswagen offered various technical explanations at different stages, including the idea that calibration choices, driving conditions, or specific hardware behaviors might account for discrepancies. In complex systems, initial explanations can sometimes be plausible, but as the investigation continued, the gap remained too large to settle with routine answers. Regulators asked for fixes and documentation. The conversation became less about isolated anomalies and more about the logic of the control system itself. A defining feature of this period is the slow shift from uncertainty to insistence. Regulators and researchers were not satisfied with surface-level reassurances. They sought a clear, verifiable account of why certified results and road results were so different. This is where organizational culture matters. If a company responds with transparency, sharing data, clarifying design intent, and cooperating fully, problems can be addressed as engineering challenges. If the company responds defensively or inconsistently, suspicion grows. By 2015, the situation reached a point where the explanation could no longer be framed as a normal technical mismatch. Volkswagen eventually acknowledged that software in certain diesel vehicles was designed in a way that affected emissions performance under testing conditions compared with typical driving. In regulatory language, this was connected to the concept of a defeat device, a prohibited approach where control logic leads the vehicle to behave differently in certification tests than in real use, in a way that misrepresents compliance. The public disclosure in September 2015 transformed the issue from a technical dispute into a global corporate crisis. Once the idea of test detection software entered public understanding, trust shifted rapidly. Consumers who believed they were buying environmentally responsible vehicles felt misled. Regulators questioned broader compliance. Investors reassessed risk. And the story moved from laboratories and engineering teams into courtrooms, boardrooms, and international headlines. This stage of the Dieselgate story teaches a critical lesson. When independent measurement reveals a persistent mismatch, the next question is not, how do we explain it, but what is true? The speed and honesty of that answer can determine whether an organization resolves a problem early or multiplies it into a much larger collapse of trust. Modern emissions compliance is not a single component. It is a system that includes engine hardware, after-treatment devices, sensors, and, most importantly, software calibration that decides how the system behaves in thousands of situations. Calibration is normal and necessary. The ethical boundary is crossed when calibration is used to create a misleading picture of compliance, rather than to meet standards consistently in real use. In Dieselgate, investigators concluded that certain Volkswagen diesel vehicles had software logic that could recognize conditions consistent with formal emissions testing and adjust emissions controls accordingly. It is important to describe this carefully and at a high level. The issue was not software exists, but that the software was designed in a way that created two different behavioral patterns, one aligned with test conditions and another that did not deliver the same level of control during ordinary driving. Why would an organization allow that to happen? The best educational answer looks at incentives and constraints rather than dramatic assumptions. Emissions compliance can be expensive. More robust control systems may require higher cost hardware, additional fluids or maintenance requirements, and careful tuning that can affect performance, fuel economy, and customer satisfaction. If leadership commits to ambitious market promises, excellent fuel economy, strong performance, low cost, and strict emissions compliance, teams may face an impossible triangle. Something must give. In a healthy culture, the organization makes explicit trade-offs: invest more, delay the product, reduce claims, or redesign. In a weaker culture, the organization may treat trade-offs as unacceptable and search for shortcuts. Shortcuts do not always begin as intentional deception. They can begin as temporary workarounds, treated as just for now, with the expectation that a better solution will arrive later. The risk is that later never arrives, and the workaround becomes built into the product. Another factor is organizational complexity. Large automakers have multiple layers of decision-making: engineering units, compliance teams, legal review, product planning, regional executives, and suppliers. Responsibility can become fragmented. One team may understand the technical behavior, another may focus on deadlines, another may assume compliance is handled elsewhere. When accountability is diffuse, it becomes easier for a questionable choice to survive because no single person feels authorized to stop the entire program. Dieselgate also highlights a modern governance challenge: auditing software-driven behavior. Traditional audits focus on financial controls and documented procedures, but an engine control strategy is not fully visible in a spreadsheet. It is embedded in code and calibration maps, validated by testing that must be designed to reflect real conditions. If compliance review relies mainly on test results without deeper scrutiny of system logic, a gap can persist. This is why regulators increasingly emphasize real driving evaluations and in-use compliance programs, because a system can be tuned to pass a lab procedure without representing everyday emissions performance. Public discussion often uses simple labels, but the deeper educational point is about systems design and ethics. When an organization defines success as passing a test rather than meeting the purpose of the rule, it is at risk of optimizing the metric instead of the outcome. Emissions tests are meant to represent clean operation. If the organization treats them as obstacles rather than safeguards, the incentive becomes achieve the certificate rather than achieve the real-world behavior. This is where culture becomes as important as technology. Engineers can be proud of clever solutions, but cleverness must be guided by integrity. Compliance teams must be empowered, not sidelined. Leaders must reward truth-telling, not only milestone delivery. And boards must ask questions that cannot be answered with slogans. How do we know this performance holds outside the lab? What is the evidence? Who is accountable for in-use results? By the time Dieselgate became public, the consequences were not limited to one design decision. They reflected a wider set of weaknesses: ambitious positioning, insufficient internal challenge, and a system that allowed compliance to be treated as a performance target rather than a real-world responsibility. This part of the story is not about teaching anyone how such behavior occurs. It is about understanding why controls must evolve as products become software defined. When the Dieselgate disclosure became public in 2015, the most immediate impact was psychological. Trust changed shape overnight. Volkswagen's brand had been built on engineering confidence, safety, and long-term reliability. The diesel program, especially in the United States, carried an added promise of responsible innovation. Once the public learned that emissions performance had been misrepresented, the story stopped being about technology and became about credibility. Regulators in multiple countries responded with investigations, formal notices, and demands for remedies. In the United States, agencies pursued enforcement actions related to emission standards, certification accuracy, and consumer protection. Other jurisdictions opened inquiries and reviewed how diesel vehicles were certified, tested, and marketed. The global nature of Volkswagen's sales meant that the consequences were not confined to one country. They spread across markets, legal frameworks, and consumer expectations. Operationally, Volkswagen had to manage recalls and technical fixes. A recall is not simply a mechanical event, it is a customer relationship event. Owners want clarity: what changed, why it matters, and how it affects performance and reliability. Dealers want guidance. Service networks must be trained and equipped, and the company must coordinate messaging carefully because every new detail influences public confidence. Even a well-intentioned repair can become emotionally complicated if consumers suspect it is designed mainly to reduce liability rather than restore trust. Financially, the crisis quickly became enormous. The company faced multiple categories of cost: legal settlements, regulatory penalties, vehicle buyback or compensation programs in some regions, engineering and service expenses, and lost sales. Beyond direct costs, there were indirect costs: increased borrowing expenses, shifts in market valuation, and strategic disruptions. A crisis of trust also affects partnerships. Suppliers, fleets, and institutional customers may re-evaluate long-term commitments. Leadership consequences followed. Corporate crises often trigger resignations, internal restructuring, and changes in oversight. But the deeper question is not only who leaves, it is what changes so it cannot repeat. Dieselgate forced Volkswagen, and by extension the wider auto industry, to confront how compliance is managed when products are software-driven and testing procedures are predictable. At the same time, the story became a public lesson in how regulation works in practice. Certification is not the end of oversight, it is the beginning. Regulators look at in-use behavior, consumer complaints, independent research, and market patterns. When discrepancies appear, the process can escalate from technical questions to legal consequences if the explanations do not hold. Dieselgate demonstrated that in mature markets, the costs of misleading compliance can far exceed the costs of early honesty and redesign. Another layer of impact was reputational spillover. Volkswagen is a flagship German manufacturer, and the story influenced perceptions of national industrial competence, corporate governance, and the relationship between industry and regulation. Yet, the most constructive interpretation avoids stereotyping. The lesson is universal. Any large organization, anywhere, can drift if targets are unrealistic and internal challenge is weak. The risk is not tied to a country, it is tied to systems and incentives. As investigations progressed, the public learned more about how long the issue had existed and how widely it affected vehicles. That widening scope made the crisis feel less like an isolated mistake and more like a systemic breakdown. In such moments, trust is rebuilt not by a single statement, but by repeated proof, transparent cooperation, clear remedies, and credible reforms. By 2017, Volkswagen was deep into legal resolution in several jurisdictions and was also reshaping strategy, accelerating moves toward electrification and changing how compliance and software governance were managed. Dieselgate did not end quickly. It became a long chapter that continued to influence the company and the industry for years. One of the most lasting outcomes of Dieselgate was not a single fine or settlement, but a shift in how emissions compliance is expected to work. The core weakness exposed by the scandal was the gap between controlled laboratory results and real-world driving. If a vehicle can appear clean in a standardized test while behaving differently in daily use, then the testing regime itself needs reinforcement. In Europe, a major change was the move toward improved test procedures and real driving emissions evaluations. The worldwide Harmonized Light Vehicles Test Procedure, WLTP, replaced older lab cycles in many contexts, aiming to better reflect real driving patterns. Alongside this, real driving emissions (RDE) testing introduced on-road measurements using portable systems, adding a layer of accountability beyond the lab. These reforms were designed to reduce the test-only mindset by making real-world behavior part of compliance expectations. In the United States, regulators intensified attention to in-use compliance and the accuracy of certification claims. The Dieselgate story reinforced the idea that compliance must be robust under diverse conditions, not merely under a predictable evaluation setup. It also highlighted the importance of documentation and transparency. When regulators ask why, companies must provide clear evidence, not complicated storytelling. Another important shift was cultural. Emissions compliance became more visibly linked to corporate governance. Boards and audit committees could no longer treat compliance as a technical detail buried deep in engineering. If the product is software defined, then software governance becomes a board-level risk. That includes internal approvals for calibration strategies, traceability of changes, independent review of high-risk logic, and the empowerment of compliance functions to stop launches when concerns arise. The scandal also affected how the industry talks about innovation. Before Dieselgate, marketing often framed diesel as a near-perfect solution, efficient, powerful, and responsible. After Dieselgate, the market became more skeptical of simple claims. Consumers, journalists, and regulators asked for evidence and transparency. This skepticism accelerated interest in alternative technologies, hybrids, electrification, and advanced gasoline systems, though each technology also carries its own challenges and trade-offs. From a systems perspective, Dieselgate pushed regulators to consider how to monitor complex software-based products. Traditional oversight assumes that hardware behaves consistently unless broken. Software can behave differently by design. That means oversight must include clearer definitions of prohibited strategies, better data access for regulators, and testing that is harder to game because it varies conditions and focuses on real-world performance. A quieter but valuable outcome was the role of independent research. The Dieselgate story demonstrated that universities and nonprofit technical organizations can play a constructive role in public accountability, measuring, publishing, and raising questions based on evidence. When independent testing becomes part of the ecosystem, it strengthens the feedback loop between rules and real-world outcomes. Dieselgate also influenced internal corporate practices beyond Volkswagen. Many automakers increased compliance staffing, improved documentation, strengthened internal audits for calibration processes, and expanded real-world validation. Even companies not directly involved learned that reputational risk from compliance failure is massive, and that the cost of prevention is far lower than the cost of crisis. Over time, these changes helped shift emissions compliance toward a more realistic standard, not perfect on paper, but consistent in practice. The broader educational lesson is that regulation is a living system. When a scandal exposes a weakness, the best response is not only punishment, it is redesign of tests, incentives, oversight, and corporate culture so that the next generation of rules is harder to misrepresent and easier to trust. Volkswagen Dieselgate remains one of the most instructive corporate stories of the modern era because it sits at the intersection of engineering, regulation, marketing, and governance. It was not only a technical failure, it was a failure of decision-making systems. To learn from it, the most useful approach is calm and practical. Identify what allowed the gap to persist and what would prevent similar outcomes in any organization. The first lesson is that compliance must be defined by purpose, not by paperwork. Emissions rules exist to protect air quality in everyday life, not only in controlled laboratories. When a company treats certification as a hurdle to clear rather than a responsibility to uphold, it risks optimizing the appearance of compliance rather than the reality. The corrective mindset is simple. Design for consistent real-world performance, then prove it through varied testing and transparent documentation. The second lesson is that software governance is now a core business discipline. Cars are increasingly software defined. That means ethical risk can be embedded in logic, not only in hardware. Strong governance includes clear approval pathways for calibration decisions, traceable change logs, independent review for high impact strategies, and internal mechanisms that allow engineers and compliance staff to raise concerns without career fear. Speak Up must be supported by structure, not slogans. The third lesson is about leadership realism. If targets require impossible trade offs, low cost, high performance, and strict real world emissions under all conditions, leaders must either invest more or revise goals. When leaders insist that everything must be perfect without providing resources, teams may search for shortcuts. The healthiest organizations prefer a difficult truth early over a costly crisis later. The fourth lesson is about measurement. Independent testing helped reveal the Dieselgate mismatch. That suggests a broader principle. Transparency strengthens trust. When products affect public outcomes, accountability improves when multiple parties can measure performance: regulators, researchers, and informed consumers. Companies that welcome measurement and respond with evidence tend to sustain trust longer than those that rely mainly on branding. The fifth lesson is how trust is rebuilt. Trust returns through repeated proof, clear remedies, consistent cooperation with oversight, and visible reforms that change incentives and accountability. A company cannot message its way out of a credibility crisis. It must demonstrate that the internal system, culture, controls, and governance has changed. Finally, Dieselgate reminds listeners that large organizations are not protected by reputation. A strong brand can make the public slower to suspect, but it does not prevent a system from drifting. The safer path is continuous integrity, aligning marketing promises with engineering reality, aligning compliance strategy with public purpose, and building governance strong enough to resist the quiet pressure to make it look fine.